Chapter 27, Section 3, The Russian Revolution. This is a very important section. This deals with the future of Europe and the United States and the world for the next 60 or 70 years. The Russian Revolution happens in 1917, which is in the middle of World War I. And the main idea, the big picture here is that the communists, the Bolsheviks, the Marxists, political forces take over Russia, overthrow the existing government, and establish a communist dictatorship that's going to last from 1917 all the way to 1991, almost the entire 20th century. This is, of course, going to lead to the reign of Stalin. World War II, of course, we fight with the Russians, but we never quite trusted them. The rule of the Soviet Union, they renamed the country from Russia to the Soviet Union. This sets up the entire Cold War, which happens from 1945 to 91. So that whole second half of the 20th century where the US and the Soviet Union were pretty much enemies, all can be traced back to this moment. Even the future of Russia as it is today, led by the government that's currently in place, which is semi-authoritarian, all can be traced back to the way that the communists established their rule. So it's a very significant section. The war itself is one of the main reasons for the revolution in terms of it weakened the government of Russia at the time. Initially in Russia, like everywhere else in Europe, there was a lot of excitement about the war. They thought that they could get a lot of territory perhaps, maybe conquer parts of Eastern Europe. They maybe hoped to expand into the Balkans, and remember they were allies with Serbia. So they were hoping to increase their sphere of influence, particularly conservatives in Russia were hoping that the war would lead to that. Liberals and socialists at the time hoped that the war would bring reforms and changes which were much needed. Remember the czars of the 19th century, they got rid of serfdom, but then they stopped all other political progress once Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. So they'd moved forward a little bit economically, not so much politically, and as always in Russian history, they're still far behind and trying to catch up. So everyone in Russia was hoping for something when the war began. The war did not go well for Russia. Look at this chart. Just pause it a minute and just sort of absorb the numbers that this shows. Casualties, dead, wounded, percentage of soldiers that were either killed or wounded in the war. And it's no surprise that something dramatic was going to happen in Russia. Look at those numbers. By far the worst experience in the war. The war experience was so bad. Even though they were mobilizing and they had all these preparations, they sent guys into war without guns, without rifles. Instead, they gave them broomsticks. What are you supposed to hit someone with a broomstick, I guess? And they said, if you really need a weapon, you're going to have to find one from a dead comrade. Find one from a dead soldier in one of the fronts of battle. How about that for morale? You get sent into that's your expectation right there. You go into battle and you're not going to get any weapons until you find a fellow dead soldier and you're going to take one from him. So look at the number of casualties just in the first year of the war, they took 2 million casualties, and then you can see it went way up from there. So it was an unsuccessful mobilization for war by far. Another thing on this chart, look at just the U.S. We're just the end of the war. We were a part of it just the last year or so. So 6.8%, pretty low with all the European countries, just much, much more. France, Russia, England, a little bit better. But remember, most of the war was fought in France. Those trenches are in northeastern France, so it's no surprise that the French army took that many hits. Anyway, terrible story of World War I in one slide. All right, so who's in charge of Russia during the war? It's the Romanov family. They've been ruling Russia for 300 years now, going back to Michael Romanov in 1615 or so, and then Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and now here we are. We have Nicholas II. He's the man on the scene, described in your book as a kindly, slightly stupid man. He was a great family man, great husband, great father, terrible king, terrible leader. And so this reminds me, this whole story actually, of the French Revolution and Louis XVI, who was sort of nice but sort of dumb. And the Romanovs are going to play out just like that. In fact, the communists, the Bolsheviks, Lenin, studied history before they led their revolution. And so did Karl Marx, by the way. They knew the story of the French Revolution, how it started off great, and then it split among all the forces, and there was a reign of terror, and the whole thing collapsed. They knew all this. So when they went into it, they had thought they had learned the lessons of history, where they weren't going to let those things derail their revolution. So anyway, Nicholas II. Had this beautiful family. His wife was German. Sound familiar? Remember Louis XVI's wife? Not German, but Austrian. So very remarkable stuff here. So 4 daughters that were all teenagers at the time, and he had 1 son. And we're going to get into their story here in a little bit. But they were beautiful children. They were widely known in Europe. Pictures of them everywhere. They were popular. They were almost like socialites. Anyway, he was a great family man, but a terrible king, and he resisted modernization. Remember, he had crushed the 1905 revolution. He had passed the October Manifesto and all that, but then he basically didn't do any of the things he said he would do. He was a conservative. He relied on the church, the bureaucracy, loyal government officials, and he would not modernize the country. So the whole thing goes down on his watch. He will take the blame. Probably had the chance to change it, and he didn't. Meanwhile, as soon as the war was beginning, there were liberals in the government, the Duma, that's the parliament, that were calling for a new government from the beginning. They were still bitter from the 1905 revolution that failed, and he sort of tricked them, the Tsar tricked them. So there was a building effort to change Russia even from before the war. And so here's what happens. In the midst of World War I, Russians are taking massive losses. The Tsar made a huge mistake. He decided to go to the front to personally lead the army. He had very little military training. He was not a good leader, not a good commander, and he's going to go out to the front and take personal command of the army to prove that he could lead, to rally the troops, to make them, fight better and be the hero. And this is the end of the story. This is where it all goes off track. Because his son, and you may have heard this in the past, the little boy had a bleeding disease called hemophilia. Okay, it means when you get cut, your blood doesn't clot and you bleed and you don't stop bleeding and you can bleed out, and it's really bad. Now, this was a genetic disease inherited from the fact that the royal families of Europe, once again, as in the past, were all intermarried, and there was a recessive trait, hemophilia, that came from the Queen Victoria of England, actually, who was one of the great aunts or great grandmothers of these people. And so anyway, the little boy's got hemophilia. Now this wife, Alexandra, that's the Tsar's wife, the German wife, basically when Nicholas II went to the front, she became the leader of Russia. She ruled in his absence and was making political decisions about how to run the country. And it was not good. And the boy's condition, the little boy, Alexei is his name, it got worse. When his father left to the front, his bleeding disease got worse. So the Tsar's wife was desperate. She was a very religious woman. She had tried doctors and everything she could think of, and went to she was, of course, very Russian Orthodox religion, so she had priests come in and pray for the child. She'd done everything she could, and it was still not getting better. So then she heard about a man from Siberia who claimed special healing powers over sick people. And he had a really extensive reputation of being this wild guy from far away. He was a peasant. He was not even in the church. He had been kicked out of the church for terrible behavior, debauchery, terrible things, gross things. But yet he was this mystical guy that said he could heal people. And she heard of him, and through one connection or another, this guy got invited into the Russian inner circle to heal and be a part of their family. And that man, of course, is none other than Grigory Rasputin, the mad monk himself. And this guy is going to lead, in part, to the destruction of the Russian Empire. So he would get around this boy, and here's the mother, of course, taking care of her little boy, wants nothing more than for him to be healed. And here comes Rasputin, this crazy guy with a crazy beard. He smelled terrible, they said, but he would get around the boy, and the boy would get magically better. And so people started, the Tsar's wife, Alexandra, really believed this guy was the truth, and he had these kind of spiritual powers. On the other hand, Rasputin was a tremendous drinker and partier, and he would carry on all night with women of St. Petersburg, and he had this entourage of people that were his partiers, and he was just this perverted guy. Okay, not the least holy man you could think of, but then he claimed to be this incredible, he said, I am Christ in miniature, God in mind, man in the flesh. So he said, and there basically without sin, there can be no redemption. So why don't you just sin all you want? This is the kind of guy this guy was. So he's a notorious, kind of madman. Anyway, this guy started gaining political power, Rasputin. So the czars, he'd heal the boy, and the czarina would be in such awe, she would turn over important political decisions to him as sort of payment for healing the kid. So this guy starts making decisions about the war, troops, policy, and he's a nutcase. So the people in Russia hear about this, and they think our government's corrupt. This is inept, they're corrupt, this is a cesspool, we got to get rid of this guy. He's taken down the regime. So all of the nobles, a group of nobles in Russia, plot against Rasputin. And they go, this guy's out of control, we got to take him out. So they plot his murder. And this is one of the greatest stories in European history. These guys invite Rasputin to a dinner party. By the way, St. Petersburg is a beautiful city. This is the capital, built by Peter the Great, still around, gorgeous. And they go, we got to get this guy out. So they plot and they invite him to this dinner party at this house. And they promised him that there'd be a prostitute waiting for him. This is how you get Rasputin to show up, of course. Lots of drink and a prostitute. So he shows up. And they've got all these different methods ready to kill him. They've got poisoned cake, they've got poisoned wine, and so they feed him these poisoned items all night, but the guy wouldn't die. And they were shocked, and it turns out he'd most likely been building up an immunity to cyanide, the poison, because he believed people were going to kill him because he was this spiritual kind of guy. So they try to poison him with wine and with bread, and he doesn't die, and so they eventually shoot him a couple times as they get so frustrated. And even then he keeps going. He can't kill the guy, okay? So he's running, he's like, his adrenaline's going, he's been shot, he's trying to escape, he's running out the door to the garden. They finally get him, they toss him into the river, which is right in front of the house here, which was frozen over at the time, and eventually he dies, and the body washes up a few days later, and they do an autopsy on the body, and the listed cause of death is not poison and not bullets, but drowning. So figure that one out. This is one of the most famous things in the history of Europe, but this guy has taken down essentially the Russian monarchy. Amazing. So this doesn't solve anything ultimately. Sadly, look at that. The war is still going terrible, even though Rasputin is gone. There are hungry people in the streets, soldiers dying at the front, and sounds like the French Rev here, hungry women start to initiate bread riots in March of 1917. Now Rasputin was killed in December of 1916. This is just 3 months later. The Tsar from the front, Nicholas II, hears about the riots in the streets of St. Petersburg, and he says, we've got to break them up. He sends telegrams back and forth to his army, whatever's left of it in St. Petersburg. You got to dispel the riot, get rid of the crowds, shoot them if necessary. He actually ordered the soldiers to open fire on basically hungry women, children, and old people because all the men were gone. And here they are, relatively peacefully demanding bread. The soldiers at the time refused to obey this order, and they dropped their weapons and joined the crowds. And this is the end for the Tsar. When the army won't obey you, you're done. So the Duma declared at this moment, the parliament, they hear all this is happening, they say, we got to have a provisional government, provisional, Provisional. And that means temporary. We reject the Tsar's leadership. The Tsar heard about this from the front, and he abdicated. He did probably the right thing. He goes, no one is on my side anymore. I got to get out. So he quits. So again, popular forces spark big changes in the government. Storming of the Bastille, Women's March to Versailles. All this should remind you of the French Rev. All right? This whole series of events that happens in March of 1917 is called the March Revolution. And it culminates, of course, in Nicholas II abdicating, quitting. And this is the end of Tsarist rule after 300 years of it. And now the Duma, the parliament, enacted all kinds of liberal reforms right away. And this is going to be, they reject anything radical. So this is going to be moderate, liberal. Sounds really great. And they're going to call again the provisional government. And the provisional government is led by this guy, Alexander Kerensky. He was an American-trained lawyer. He's a Russian guy, but he'd lived in America. He was very aware of world politics. And this guy was really the hope for the future of Russia. If only he had succeeded. He was going to allow freedom of religion, freedom of speech, multi-party system, elections. They were going to finally liberalize the country and make it like Great Britain, France, or the U.S., and yet the critical mistake is that they would not back out of the war. The Russian people, they misread the population. They misread the anger of the people in Russia. They thought that they could keep doing the war with all these political changes and it would make people happy. It did not. They continued the war and they lost the support of all of the Russian people. And quickly then, to meet that anger, is a rival government started called the Petrograd Soviet. And Petrograd is the word for St. Petersburg, but the word Soviet is important. A Soviet is a council of workers, a little group of army officers, perhaps soldiers and workers who get together in the bars, in the cafes, in the streets, and they're somewhat educated and they start plotting, and they're Marxist by nature. They're socialists, okay? And these guys quickly they spring up all over Russia because they're so angry about the war and life at home, and they become a counter-government to rival the new provisional government led by Kerensky. So you got everything's very chaotic, a lot of upheaval. They've gotten rid of the Tsar, and now there's like a power vacuum here. And on one hand, you got Kerensky and the liberals trying to reestablish a new regime, and then you got these Marxists on the other side. So Kerensky's a liberal, not a Marxist. And you got the Marxists in these Soviets trying to take power from the other side. So it's almost a civil war, not quite. They're not fighting, but it's a political conflict for sure. Okay? By the time things are shaking out, this is only going to take 3 or 4 months where these guys are duking it out from March to November 1917. The Petrograd Soviet starts issuing orders to the army. Which are not legal, but that doesn't matter. They issue Army Order Number 1, which says, soldiers of the front, stop obeying your officers. It's a call for mutiny. All power in the army is now officially transferred to the soldiers, not the commanders. And do whatever you want, soldiers. You don't have to obey anymore. So it's a declaration of anarchy, essentially. Now, the soldiers really want to hear that. That's good news to them. They've been dying in the war for 3 years. So the soldiers completely break down. The discipline of the army breaks down. Anarchy starts to grow. And the soldiers just start leaving the war. They start walking back from the front to Russia, or getting on a train or whatever. They're voting with their feet. We don't want to fight this war anymore. In the past, you'd be executed for that, for treason. But now the army is overrun by anarchy, and the guys just start fleeing the war. And on the way home, they start taking land from rich people in Russia. So it's a complete, and of course Kerensky and these guys are just trying to stop all this and get control, and they're out, and they're losing. Who hears about all this? The hero of the Russian Revolution, or the villain, depending on how you see it. The leader, nonetheless, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. This is the father of communism in modern Russia. This guy had been a professional revolutionary his whole life. He was a rich kid, kind of like Marx, grew up in Russia, and was a born Marxist. He'd studied that from his youth, and he tried to overthrow the government several times already by the time we get to the war. He and his whole family were radicals. His brother was executed for treason, and the Tsar had kicked him out of Russia into Siberia for a long time for political crimes. And then he found his way to Switzerland, which is neutral, and he could hang out there for 17 years, living in Switzerland in a sort of a free country, plotting his revolution. He always wanted to go back to Russia, but waiting for the time to be right. He said, we got to wait for, power fell into my hands like an apple falling off a tree. He was a skilled politician and a revolutionary, and he knew that the war was going to accelerate change in Russia. So this guy wants original radical Marxism, not the revisionist kind, the revolution kind, okay? And he believed that this was even possible in a country as backwards as Russia, as long as there was a highly disciplined group of leaders like himself. He called himself and his associates the vanguard. We're at the vanguard, we're the forefront. We're like the guys that go before the masses. Okay, this is his political theory. His party in Russia, or once he gets there, his faction is going to be called the Bolsheviks. Okay, that just means majority. And what they want radical, disciplined communism. Very small, they're like the Jacobins, okay? And then the Mensheviks are the minority. These are still socialists, but they're the revisionists. They want a broader movement. They want to work with the government. They want mass support, voting, democracy, no revolution, just change, strikes, this kind of thing is what we're going to do. This is like the Girondins, so similar. Okay, World War I provides the opportunity for Lenin to start the revolution. Okay, as soon as he heard that the Tsar was out, he was in Switzerland. The Germans, who were, of course, fighting the Russians in the war, also heard about this, and they go, we got to get Lenin back to Russia as soon as possible. He is our secret weapon. They called him that. They go, we got to get him on a train and ship him back into Russia because he'll start a revolution and he'll disrupt Russia so much that they will get out of the war or lose the war, and we Germans will win. So this is amazing. They put him on a sealed train from Zurich, Switzerland to St. Petersburg, Russia. They didn't let the train stop. They covered the windows. They didn't let him see any of the war. They put him back, they sent him there. A safe passage all across Eastern Europe to get him, and of course he gets there, arrives, and he immediately starts to lead a revolution. So the Germans play a huge part here in the Russian Revolution by installing Lenin, getting him back to his homeland. When Lenin got to Russia, he went immediately from the train station into the streets and started preaching communism, like religion. And he made converts. And he just started saying three things, simple: peace, land, and bread. Peace, land, and bread. Get out of the war, we'll feed you, and we'll give you some land from the rich. And he refused to cooperate with the provisional government. He's an enemy, of course, of Kerensky. He tried to take over the government in July of 1917 and failed, and he had to go into hiding for a month. So he was immediately getting to work on this, and he decided he needed some help. So he brings in his main squeeze here, Leon Trotsky. These guys are the 1-2 punch of the Bolsheviks. Lenin is the street face, the speech maker. Trotsky's more of the intellectual side of things. He's the calculating guy. He runs the army. Whereas Lenin is more like the public face. And they're both good speakers, but Trotsky becomes more of like the planner of the whole thing, and the executive versus the speech maker. So here's Lenin and Trotsky, okay? Here's the two-headed monster of communism. So the Bolsheviks became 240,000 strong in just a few months. Lenin made that many disciples, converts to his cause, and they gained a majority in this Petrograd Soviet of people like-minded. So again, here's Trotsky and Lenin. They get control over the Petrograd military, and these guys orchestrate the second of these revolutions. The first revolution was in March when the Tsar was abdicating, and the provisional government took place, and now the Bolsheviks have waited 6 months, and they're ready to take power in November of 1917. We call this Red October. In the Russian calendar at that time, this was in October, but in the rest of the year, the rest of the world, we had already hit November, so we call it the November Revolution. And the Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace. They came across this massive piazza, the square in St. Petersburg, beautifully designed, of course. This is all Peter the Great's work, rebuilding the city. This Baroque, Rococo palace. This is the main seat of the government where the Tsars lived for hundreds of years, and now the provisional government is in there hanging out. So Lenin and Trotsky and their boys, they run in there, they break into that Winter Palace, and they take over in a coup at gunpoint. It wasn't very violent, not many people died. It was relatively peaceful because the provisional government just ran away. They knew that they were outnumbered. And this event becomes the real critical event, particularly later in history. The Marxists say this is like their storming of the Bastille. And they fictionalize it, and they make movies about it, and they exaggerate it, and say it was so much more than it was. It was a real event. They did take over this main government building, and immediately, but it wasn't as dramatic as the communists will say in the future. So this is a Bolshevik coup, and Lenin is going to be installed as the new head of the government. So how do they do this? How do they win? There's anarchy in Russia. Got it? There's governments and counter-governments, and that's a mess. These guys had superior leadership. Lenin and Trotsky are extremely successful speakers, and they whip up popular support. Okay, and they appeal very simply to soldiers and workers, and that's the majority of the country. They're tired of war, and the workers are hungry, and they want They want the government to take care of them. They want socialism, peace, land, bread. Simple slogans: liberty, equality, brotherhood. Got it? So this didn't just stop right there. There's a dictatorship of Lenin followed by a civil war. The Bolsheviks, of course, the whole time they promised they were going to turn over everything to the workers. It's going to be communism now. The workers are going to rise up, but that's not the way it's going to play out. All right. The Bolsheviks kept power for themselves. They approved everyone stealing land from the rich. And they did briefly experiment with giving factory control to workers, but that's not going to last very long. What they did do, the one promise they did keep, is they ended the war against Germany right away, the peace part of the peace, land, and bread. And it's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, March of 1918. just a few months down the road. And Russia quit the war before it was over. They surrendered a third of their territory and their population in the West to Germany. Huge loss. They surrendered. They go, we got bigger fish to fry here. We don't want to fight this war. We'll even get rid of a third of our people if need be. So they were willing to make peace at any price. This is all Lenin negotiating in the city of Brest and Litovsk. These are two areas, physical areas. That's why the treaty's called that. So a third of the population is turned over to Germany. But Lenin said, you know what, we don't care. We're going to start communist revolutions all over the world. We'll be back. We'll get that land back in a couple years, don't worry. We need to focus on communism and establishing that first in the homeland. Then we'll go back and retake our land. There was a constituent assembly formed. The Bolsheviks said we're going to have elections. The soldiers and the workers are going to be able to pick their leaders, and we're going to have workers run the government. Remember, that's the promise of Marxism. But the first election, turns out, wasn't won by the Bolsheviks. They had an election, and other people won. And so what the classic move here, Lenin immediately canceled the elections, said they were invalid, disbanded the constituent assembly, and became a one-man dictator. This is the true colors of Marxism. All right, they promised worker control, and when the workers spoke and voted against the communists just destroyed everybody. This all leads to a civil war for 5 or 6 years, the Russian Civil War, where there's a lot of people in Russia that don't want to be ruled by communists, and we're going to call those the whites. The whites are the anti-communist forces. Okay, and there's the army, particularly the officers, not the soldiers, the officers, anyone that was really a democratic, a moderate socialist, anyone that didn't like communism, anyone that believed in democracy. Foreign countries are supportive of the whites. The Americans, the British support the whites. These are the anti-Bolshevik forces. And then there's the Reds, and the Reds are the communists. The Red Army, the Bolsheviks, followers of Lenin, radicals. These are the Mensheviks are whites, the Bolsheviks are Reds. This civil war is going to carry on 6 years and kill 15 more million people in Russia. All of World War I killed 9 million Russians. Now you're going to tack on another 15. We're at 24 million dead Russians, and we haven't even hit Stalin yet. He's going to take out another 25 million or more. And then World War II is going to come. So the Russians are just going to get decimated for the next 25 years. Terrible. The Bolsheviks win the Civil War. The Reds, of course, you know this, because they got a better leadership. They got Trotsky and Lenin. These guys have a message, and it's simple. They got a disciplined army. They got radical supporters. They enact what's called war communism, which means the government immediately takes over everything that they could get and starts making all the decisions about factories and production and army and all this. So, they were fighting for their lives here, but they were very disciplined. They waged a reign of terror against all their enemies. Again, think French Revolution here. The Bolsheviks, it's called the Cheka, is the name of their secret police. The Cheka is in charge of the reign of terror. And they murder and mow down anybody that is a suspected enemy of the Bolsheviks. A famous story is in the theater once in Moscow during the Civil War. There's a performance, and a clown, of course, or a circus performance, I think. And there was a clown there, and the clown was, in between acts or whatever, getting up on stage, and he made a joke or something about the Bolsheviks, or made fun of them in some way to try to get the audience to laugh. And there was secret police in the audience, members of the Cheka, and they all just stood up and shot the clown right in the middle of a theater. That's the kind of thing that you do when you have a reign of terror. So that kind of fear. There's no guillotine, there's guns now. So that makes it far worse than anything in the French Revolution. And atrocities are committed on both sides. You can see, look, a Bolshevik rule is kind of this dark red area. The white cross-hatched area is the advance of the anti-Bolsheviks. They were trying to come in from the outside, right? And so they were advancing and didn't really get far. Cities gained by Bolsheviks by coup. Okay, so you see St. Petersburg was the main coup there in the storming of the Winter Palace. So people are trying to close them in from the outside, and they're trying to expand to the outside. So the front lines are in the sort of like that dashed red space. So anyway, it's going to go on and on and on, but the Reds are going to win. They got a better army, and they got a better message, more appealing. The Whites are kind of disorganized. There's no unifying message. It's a whole collection of people that didn't really know each other. The Reds are very disciplined and elite. So in the middle of the Civil War, Lenin, they look at the city of Yekaterinburg right there. See those blue lines? Those are advancing whites. So that's where the royal family had been hiding out, Yekaterinburg, since they abdicated. They had become common citizens, and they had been put under house arrest initially by Kerensky, but then under Lenin, we got to keep these people under control. Now the royal family wanted to go into exile. They wanted to go to England, get a farmhouse or something, and live out the rest of their life. Nicholas II and his family, but that didn't happen. The communists are keeping watch on them in this house in Yekaterinburg. And again, these guys are hoping that maybe the White Army will come and rescue them. The Tsar hoped that. And of course, Lenin believed that the White Army, if they captured the Tsar, would try to put him back on the throne. So what do they do with this guy? They're stuck. Are they going to put him on trial? They decide the best thing to do is to kill him. They're going to execute these guys in the middle of the summer of 1918, in the middle of the Civil War. Lenin most likely personally ordered the death of Nicholas II and his family. And it's this horrible story, and they take him down to a basement of this house where they were staying in the middle of the night and said, "We're going to take your picture before we move you to a safer house." And they pull out guns and they execute all of them, the women, the children, the daughters, the son with hemophilia, the cook, their doctor, their servants. There was about 20 people in the room, and they just mow them all down in one of the most gruesome acts of political violence of all time. Stories emerged. Oh, and then they burned the bodies. They doused them with acid. They put them in a mine shaft. They tried to cover up all trace of this immediately to hide what they did. Of course, and then in future history, the communists will deny that they did this. And it takes until 1991 for anyone to figure out that this actually happened. So this is incredible, hiding of history. The stories came out over the years that maybe one of the daughters survived, and the daughter whose name was Anastasia, maybe somehow she got away, wasn't killed, and women would come forth in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s that are old women claiming to be Anastasia, trying to get whatever was left of the crown jewels or the royal inheritance. And eventually, after 1991, when communism ended and people were open again, they could do research and look into this stuff. They did DNA testing and proved that all the bodies were there, and these women that came out were imposters. But it took, almost a century for the truth to come out. And then once it did come out, the people of Russia kind of changed their view of the Tsar, and they buried him in a royal grave. They got the bones and they put him in this beautiful ceremony, and they've been named saints by the Russian Orthodox Church. They're martyrs now. Their legacy, they call it being rehabilitated. Their legacy was restored, and they've become almost heroes to many of the Russian people. Even though at the time they were really, really hated. So history has turned a bit. So the Russian Civil War, right, here we go, finish up the story. Even the foreign countries got involved. The US, Britain, and Japan all fought on behalf of the whites because we hated communism. We didn't want to see a communist nation established in Russia. We didn't really fight on the front lines. We were mainly trying to stop war materials from getting up into the country. We were more like on the edges, kind of. We didn't really fight hand to hand with the Bolsheviks. We were letting Russians do that. But anyway, this actually inadvertently backfired and kind of helped the Bolsheviks say that, look, everyone in the world is against us. Now this promotes morale among the radicals here. When you see that you've got enemies everywhere, we got to win. They're closing in on us. But really, because there was all this foreign support, this is the first battle of the Cold War between capitalist forces and communist forces in Europe. And the Russians are never going to forget that. They go, you started the Cold War when you intervened in our Civil War, and you messed with us. And so now it's on. The effort on the part of the foreigners was weak, pretty much. And again, it backfired and allowed the Bolsheviks to appeal to a sense of nationalism, that it's us against the world, people, and it worked. So the Russian Rev, again, turning point in world history. From 1917 onward, it leads to a one-party dictatorship controlled only by the Communist Party and its leader. This goes, of course, from Lenin, and then it's going to go to Stalin, and after Stalin comes Khrushchev, after Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and after Brezhnev, Gorbachev. That's it. That's the whole history of the Soviet Union and a couple of leaders, and Gorbachev's the last guy. It's going to lead to the massive losses and persecution of their own citizens, the Cold War, all the way to 1991. So it's a very significant issue, the Russian Revolution. That's it for now.